You're listening to the Change is Vibrant webinar series. For organisations responding to a major shift in the world around them, this webinar series provides practical wisdom and immediately usable techniques. From the pain of restructuring to shifting to a customer-centric mindset and reskilling your people, we'll tackle the real challenges that bring so many great organisations unstuck. I'm your host, Carrie Bedingfield, and this series features Alan Sears, head honcho at Vybrant Organisation.
Hello.
Alan has dedicated his career to developing the skills and capabilities of people who are stepping up as leaders and managers or facing change right across the world. And in a world that is shifting faster than many leaders and managers can run, Alan is the voice of reason and sanity. Welcome, Alan.
Hello, Carrie. Thank you very much for that.
So today we are addressing the challenge that leaders face when they are restructuring their business or leading amidst a restructure in the organisation. And I'm going to start with the big question. Why are we so terrible at communicating and leading and engaging people during restructuring? So why does nobody ever say, oh, well, my company are doing this a great job of keeping me clear and motivated through this really quite long restructuring process. And I'm actually really excited about how it's changing my work and all the future possibilities. Why are we so bad at this, Alan?
Thank you for a great starting point. That may be a slightly leading question, why are we so terrible at this? And I might come on to this a bit later on, but I think it may be that it's one of those things that when it's well done, we don't really hear about it until somebody writes the case study up some years later on. But I would agree with you, and certainly in our work, we're usually only contacted by someone who is in a situation where it's not working very well. I guess if something's working very well for you, you don't look for help outside the organisation. But I think actually the answer to the main question, where it's not done well, I think it's two reasons. I think it's fundamentally underestimating the need for communication and not checking that it's happened. In fact, George Bernard Shaw, the playwright, who said the fundamental, I can't quite remember the exact quote, but it was something like the fundamental problem with communication is the misunderstanding that it's taken place. So very often we'll go into an organisation that says we can't really understand why this change program or this, let's talk about the restructure, why this is being met with so much resistance and it's not working. When it's all for the good of everybody, and of course that's not always the case, but that's another thing we'll come on to. And so you go around the organisation and talk to people, they say, well, we don't know about this, and nobody's told us about that, and we don't know what's going on over here, and we don't know what's going to happen there. So we go back to the leadership, back to the boardroom, and say, well, there's your problem. And they say, and notice the we and they in all of this, because that's very often how it is. They say, but we've told them all of that. and quite often the leaders look quite shocked, but we've communicated all of that. We've told everybody. And sometimes that comes down to something astonishingly as fundamental as, yes, but we sent an email out that covered all of those points. And then you say, well, was everybody in the organisation on email? And it turns out, no, email sort of stops at a manager level or in some other distinction in the company. But so that's a one channel communication, and no checking. So I think those are the fundamental areas where it mostly goes badly wrong.
And given that a restructuring is a major project, it will have a team associated with it, it will have obviously leadership support, sponsorship, there will be so much about that restructuring that we thought through. There may well be some expensive consultants who are being paid to design it. Why does the part about engaging people get missed off? Why is that not more obvious?
That is a really interesting question, and I would say that it's still generally the case that people approach the problem a bit as though they're on an MBA course. So they do it like it's a case study. They do it as an outside-in and a top-down approach. even if they think they're the kind of organisation that's flat and non-hierarchical and so on, the outside in is, well, look, this is why we need to do it. You know, we need to move this division out there and pull out of this market and get into that one. Or maybe it's a kind of digital transformation that requires a restructure. We need to change the way everybody's doing everything. So whether they do it literally on pieces of paper or on computer screens or just mentally, I think there's a sort of force field approach going along. Well, so the reasons for doing it are completely compelling and outweigh all these other ones. So we'll then ignore the reasons why people might not want to do it. And then, as I say, I think there's a top-down thing, because typically I think people do go off and plan this stuff in secret. Now, I do understand that, particularly if you are leading a publicly quoted company, balancing up the stakeholders is going to be very difficult in some of these situations. So there's governance around what you have to tell shareholders and when and so on. So I think there's a tendency to go away and plan in secret, and then come back and unveil the plan. Now, at that point, all the people in the project and the expensive consultants and everybody else who's worked on it, they're all fully cognizant of all of this. They've been working with this perhaps for months. The whole thing makes total sense to them, and therefore it must make total sense to everybody else. But if everybody else is still living on a flat Earth and you're the person who's saying the Earth goes around the sun, that might need a bit more communicating than you're thinking about at the moment.
So you've lost your ability to see it through the eyes you had originally, where before it happened.
That's extremely well expressed. Thank you. I'll pinch that. Absolutely. So it's about organisationally using empathy or perceptual positions or something like any kind of form of thinking or exercise that helps you to see a situation from someone else's point of view. And I do think that's the bit that gets lost, because everybody in the project gets immersed in it. And somebody may say, oh yes, but you know, if I'm doing this in this department or in this geographical location, how am I going to view that? But that's still probably being dealt with inside that team. So without actually going and finding out how it might be viewed out there, you are still operating in the dark. You're pulling levers in the boardroom and hoping it has the right effect.
So you've got this situation where the unintended outcome of doing anything in secret is that you form a team of people who and divorce them from empathy with those who are not in that team, and they're probably fairly blind to that lack of empathy as well. So they need to add that in somehow.
Yes, absolutely. And of course, you've created an elite. Everybody who's in the know about what's happening, they're an elite, not necessarily by rank or status in the organisation, but they've now got the privilege of knowledge. And of course, if they are bound up in confidentiality, then that tends to enhance that internal feeling of status.
And what happens when you feel like you are low status, that things have been discussed, important things that massively impact your life that you weren't aware of, and you're still not part of those discussions?
Well, that's very disempowering. And leading on from that, so maybe you don't know that anything's going to happen until you get the all points email. And I think something that, an effect that's often underestimated, is if I get that email, I look at that, I read what's going to happen, and I think somebody's been planning this for months. And that immediately leads to the mindset of I'm being done unto. I didn't have any say in this. And it might be, you said, well, why aren't people feeling motivated and excited about this? It might be that actually this is a way of working, or a new role, or working with new technology or something. But once I've moved through the change piece and got into it, I might be really enthusiastic about it. I might be going to look back and say, wow, those were the bad old days and this is the bright new future. And that's wonderful. But it's certainly not going to help me to get there, to think that someone's been planning my future at work without letting me in on it. And I do accept not everything can be done in a sort of total Greek-style democracy where we're going to get all of our 200,000 employees around the world standing in the same marketplace or even connected to the same virtual platform and having a vote about it. And voting is a bad way to decide a lot of things. But that wasn't a politically motivated comment, just to be clear for anybody watching. There's a lot of research, more about small teams than about countries, but about why voting tends to bring you a suboptimal solution. And that's what was really in my mind there. But so maybe we can't do it completely democratically and in that way. But I think just focusing in on what goes wrong, I think in the situation I was just describing, you've just engendered this disempowering, I've been done unto mindset in a lot of people. And I think if it's okay just to continue with it on that point, but so what could you do better? Well, the more all the evidence is around at the moment, well, perhaps not all of it, but there's quite a lot of evidence that there is a shift in effective leadership styles from less command and control into more democratic, consultative styles. And I think very often, even with something as apparently complex and technical as a restructure, if it's possible to go out and get people's views on it, what you'll gain is information that will improve it. So it's a little bit like, and I'm going back quite a long time, but when TQM was first introduced in total quality management in Japanese manufacturing, somebody had this bright idea of, you know what, maybe the people who know best how to make this car without any bit of it not fitting or being wrong or later failing, and the people who are actually putting it together, which is totally controversial and not what we were counterintuitive at the time. The idea was no, the designers, the quality controllers, and people, other people who know that best. So my view is that the more you can consult, the advantage of that is usually claimed to be empowerment and a feeling of getting everybody on side. I think its biggest advantage probably is the actual information you get, because sometimes you will get well, that won't work, and I can tell you why. And not just it won't work because people won't support it, but it won't work because there's this other thing over there that we know about that you've left out of your plan.
And if we this is so interesting. So if we take this one step further, in Frederick Ballou's book about reinventing organisations, his model is obviously around self-organising. And if you take that to its logical conclusion, then anybody who worked on the factory floor could buy a new machine. They could start the process of buying the new machine and buy it. And his argument is, or his counter to that is, and if you are buying a new machine and spending a lot of the organisation's money, it is your responsibility to seek advice from anybody for whom that change would, anybody who has knowledge or skills about that change. So of course you're going to go to finance and talk to them about it, and anybody who is materially affected by it. And I quite like the idea of seeking advice, because I wonder if the word consultation itself has become a bit drained of meaning. I wonder what you think about that.
I think that's a really great point, actually. Yeah, I think you're absolutely right, because I think consultation is a tainted word, because it sounds almost like, is it okay if we do this? Well, it may be the case that there are compelling reasons for doing it, and we're not really asking, is it okay if we do this? What we're really asking is, what's the best way in which we could do this? And the consultation processes, I think, probably are often based around that. Even when it's well, nowadays it might be more in the public sector, where you've got a leadership or a management group trying to negotiate with a unionised workforce. It may still be the case that we are going to lose a number of people from the organisation, and the conversation is how, not whether. Yeah. But I think it's got this connotation of, oh, we better go and ask everybody whether it's okay to do this.
Have been seen to have consulted. To be seen to have consulted.
Yeah. So yes, perhaps what we need is a new and grander term for getting advice, because I think you're right. That's what it is. It's gathering information, really. It's just, I mean, you have massive resources around this, so you can look outside and see what's been successful elsewhere. There are great case studies you can go and look at and see, well, who's done this well. You can get good consultants to help you. People who've seen it done well have seen it done badly. It can give you a rapid checklist of what to do and what not to do. But actually, you do have a huge resource inside your information. Sorry, a huge resource inside your organisation, and that resource is largely internal information. Andrew, can I add one point into your original question, why are we so terrible at this? I think that leaders often are aware that the initial reaction won't be good, probably because they've done this kind of thing before and the initial reaction was never good, so we have a pattern and a belief about it that's running around there. And when people think that the initial reaction from someone else is going to be difficult or uncomfortable, they tend to dodge the issue. Yeah. And of course, keeping it in the project team and all that until it's all set in stone, and then sending out an email to tell everybody is dodging the issue. And going and seeking advice from everybody around would be bringing the issue right into the light, putting it under the light, and having a good discussion about it.
Yeah, this is so interesting. So just pulling out something you've been building on a bit. It sounds like one of the tools we might have is to be really clear about what's off the table, what's already decided, and what's on the table. So rather than trying to pretend consult about the thing that actually is already decided,
yes,
fail to gain the insight about the bit that is changeable, what would you recommend organisations do?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I must say, we are very much in favour of generally a consultative approach, to go back to the slightly tainted word, wherever that's possible. We constantly advise on a town hall methodology. Now, obviously, that frequently has to be done virtually in large organisations. If you're in a smaller organisation, you can get people together. That's great. Some big organisations organise roadshows and go off around the geography, which I would absolutely support. Which has the dual purpose of taking the message out to people really clearly, and so that it's not being distorted on the way. Because if you have a communication cascade, I would suggest that in most organisations there are going to be managers and team leaders who have a terrific loyalty to their people, and that loyalty to their people actually outweighs in the moment their loyalty to the overall organisation. And what that sounds like is, we've been told by headquarters that we've got to, or I'm really sorry about this, but this is not of my doing. I think you get the picture. So information cascades are going to, even if the message is going down, there's a strong likelihood that it's not quite the intent, but the cohesion behind the message is being lost, because it's not, we all need to be together in this. People are being separated out by otherwise well-intentioned managers and leaders who don't like the decision and, in effect, disowning it. So in your town hall structure, you have a senior person there who can speak for the change, for the restructuring, clearly and eloquently, and talk about all the work that has been done to prepare it. So we're getting a clean message across in clean language. But also that person has ears to hear. And that's very, very important, because what we want to hear is what people want to say. Now, I always think in these, so I've left out an important part of this. That person's not running this town hall meeting. Somebody else is. That person would be, in our model of how you make this work, a change leader or a change champion. And you need those people from every level of the organisation. So it could be, in terms of a hierarchy, because even flat organisations have some form of hierarchy, it could be a relatively junior person, but it's someone who's had some training around change generally and around facilitation. So they're actually the moderator, if you like, but our senior person has not only got the ability to keep the message straight and clean, but has ears to hear. Now, it's very helpful if they have a good whingeometer, as I like to call it. So separating out pure whinge from actual issues is very interesting. But we've just been running a big series of workshops, literally at every level through part of an organisation. When I say part, it's the European, well, it's the UK part. So we haven't been flying around the world to do this. But it's really fascinating to separate out. Perhaps nobody's told us that is not a whinge, but we were in that situation I described right at the beginning of this chat. That was an instance. So we say, people are telling us they don't know about this, and this hasn't been explained. And maybe if those things were clearly understood and explained, everything would be all right. And then the leadership going, but we've told them. But so that's an interesting one. In my opinion, that doesn't actually fall into a whinge. It just means the communication didn't go home, and we didn't perhaps quite finish this point. Nobody's checked the communication went home. So again, if you take this more, let's get people together and have a forum where we can disseminate the message cleanly, and we can listen to what people have to say, we can take a view on whether something's just a whinge or whether it's really, really, really useful information. And then some of that useful information we can follow up. And I agree, some of it might be opinion. So if somebody says, well, that won't work because, we want to dig into that and find out, well, is that a way of working issue? Is that a technology issue? Is it some other sort of issue like that that actually needs significant investigation and resolution? Or are people saying, well, that won't work because them over there, they never talk to us over here?
Yeah. So how do you, just digging into this for a moment, how do you discriminate as a leader or whoever is trying to kind of consult on and build out the rich picture of how this restructuring is going to happen? How do you discriminate between data that people are giving you that's genuinely helpful, that's accurate, and that would help to refine or make an important change that matters to the way you were thinking of doing something? How do you discriminate that from data which comes from a current mindset, which is, this is how we do things, this is what works, and I haven't yet got my head around, there's a whole new world that I have no idea about. So when do you say, great, we're going to change something based on that data, and when do you say, oh, we need to work on taking you into the new world?
Actually, that's a great question. My answer in a single word is triangulation, although you might need more than 3 points. Now, just to explain that piece of jargon, before the world of fake news, journalists used to generally be required by editors, or perhaps we should say really good ones, for working with good organisations, we're required to have 3 separate sources that all tell the same story. So it's basically you being polite about it, you don't believe what you're told the first time. You go and find a completely different viewpoint. And of course, as you hear in news stories from all around the world, very often that's difficult to do because your 3 viewpoints are giving you totally different information around it. So first of all, 3 may not be enough. And so I think there's, the first thing is just investigate it more deeply. So if that comes up, say in a forum, a town hall meeting, something like that, is to go and have a more in-depth conversation out of that environment, perhaps with the person who said it, and really be highly curious and highly investigative and gather all of that information, and then go off and test it by finding out how that situation is viewed by other people. And that, when I said you might need more than 3 points, so one of the points of view from which it might be a very good idea to look at it is to find another organisation that's done something similar and see whether that was an issue for them. It might be that it's so deep inside what you do and so technical. If it's about the way that the XYZ machine interacts with something else on the widget production line, that then asking a non-manufacturing business might not help. But if it's that kind of solution, that is usually solvable by technical people within the organisation who can say, yes, we can do that, or no, we can't. You were talking about the mindset thing, and that then becomes highly, I can't quite think of the right word, but it becomes a problem to which you can apply thinking from other places. Because the mindset shift could have happened in any kind of business. And I think also we come back to this thing that you might decide that it's really just a mindset that people are just stuck in the current way. I've been in this situation as well. When again, the leadership says, no, well, of course we can change that. That's a solved problem. But actually, you still have to find a way of implementing the solution.
So it sounds like a leadership team might well want to plan for this sort of investigation. So rather than seeing it as rather than having a timeline which assumes the consultation will come back with, or any communication will come back with, well, I don't like it, but carry on, and instead could provide space in anticipation of things that data will emerge, that will they will absolutely want to investigate, and to make that something that they welcome and want to get the absolute best out of, rather than something that slows them down. And all it does is kind of eats into their carefully planned project.
Yes, and of course, timing and speed is frequently an issue here. So there is something of a distinction between a restructure that we have thought about quite carefully and worked on. We might want to implement it pretty much as soon as we've thought about it, but it's coming from inside. It's driven by us. It's a deliberately a step to keep us, perhaps even to keep us a step ahead. Or maybe we are trying to bring ourselves into line with other people we think are a little bit ahead in our field, but it's not actually being forced on us by a terminally bad set of results, and suddenly they need to slash 5,000 jobs and so on and so forth. And I think that's another. So that's a really important distinction, actually. But even there, I've seen quite a number of organisations, both quite large and smaller, go leaping ahead into agile working and this kind of thing, and actually leaving a lot of people behind. I just met somebody quite recently who's extremely articulate about how very, very challenging their workplace is in terms of the open plan, the hot desking, and some of the other people's behaviours that go around that. Now, other people's behaviours can sound like blame, but this was basically someone, and it's a story I've heard so many times, talking about how this eats up their efficiency. And this is a very, very focused person who is talking about projects and deadlines and objectives, and what his job is and what he's expected to deliver, and how the way of working they've switched into has actually just made that much harder. And it's far from the only time I've heard that. But there's one, I can't name it, one very big organisation who showed me around their newly changed, refurbished headquarters, and I believe I was told it was the biggest refurbishment project in Europe in that year.
Wow.
I thought it was absolutely wonderful. So it was, pretty much state of the art. If you wanted to, you could work most places in the building. Okay, so HR and maybe some bits of finance were still behind the key code for confidentiality. But you just used your pass to tap a console, and it told you, oh, you said how long you wanted a work space or place for, and it showed you which ones you could have, and you chose it. And so the whole thing was absolutely wonderful. And I think most people were thoroughly enjoying that. But then they actually announced, or certainly to the team that I was working with, that they wanted that team to go and work from home a couple of days a week. And it turned out nobody wanted to do that. And of course, think of the consequences of that. Perhaps you have a partner at home, perhaps you have young children, perhaps there's constant interruptions, all kinds of things. I can't remember who it was who said that offices are interruption factories. So I think some people just see agile as upping the interruption rate. But I just chose that as an example where maybe people didn't get all the advice they could have done even from people who are saying, I don't work well in those environments. And then they could have said, maybe we need something that's a bit more like a quiet room, or you know, an old-fashioned library environment where we don't eat or drink, and we don't chat. It's just a thought. I just invented that solution, by the way. It's just an idea, but the point was, I just heard a number of people say, nobody asked us, we just thought we've got to do this, and it doesn't really work for me.
So it's interesting, and just as a slight side note, I know that in the past you've tackled, Vybrant has tackled this with interruption door hangers, for example, or desk hangers, and wasn't there an interruption cap or something where you can kind of signal to the world that you're trying to do deep work, concentrated work, but actually if you're refurbishing your organisation, or refurbishing your building, or changing the way you use space in your business, why wouldn't you have a library where if you go and sit in the library, it's obvious that you're going to chat and you're not going to have your lunch at your desk, and that you're trying to do deep work?
Yes, I'd be really interested to hear from anybody listening to this conversation whether anyone does have an example, because we love great examples of organisations that do things differently. But everybody does know an organisation that's got that. Here's the noisy and creative bit for people who like. Well, no, that doesn't mean being quiet is not creative. But here's the noisy party atmosphere, shouty, yelly bit where people are bellowing down the phone and eating sandwiches or slurping soup at their desk. I only mentioned that because it was a complaint I heard recently. And here's the bit where you can go and be very quiet and thoughtful, regardless of, what will still be agile and flexible about that. It could be, doesn't matter whether you work in branding, PR, sales, accounts, HR. We don't mind. You can work, you can be in any function. Yeah. It's about how you like to work. That would make far more sense to me than putting everybody into just functional groups and saying, well, you're in the brand team, you've got to work in the brand office.
Yes, isn't that interesting? Yeah. I'm just kind of imagining a situation where it's like the quiet carriage on a train, but in the quiet carriage there's a lot of hissed whispering and then a lot of passive aggressive frowning and tutting as well. As soon as you do some kind of rule.
I think that's because the rules of the quiet carriage have never quite been established by the railway companies. It started, if I remember correctly, as simply a fight back against people using mobile phones and earphones or earpieces that weren't actually quiet to other people. So I don't think there ever was a rule that you couldn't hold a conversation in a quiet carriage, but some people seem to think there is. And therefore, as you say, you get hissed whispering. It's just rather amusing.
So we've talked about how organisations can develop more empathy and use the consultation process to create a better result. How they can communicate cleanly through the town hall style event or whatever that is, and that in this kind of high stake communication and engagement scenario, direct communication is good, helps communicate cleanly, and avoid the effect of people imposing their own story over it because it affects them too, and kind of tribalizing into teams. What else should organisations be doing to engage people along the way while there is grey area and uncertainty?
Yes, that is a difficult one because sometimes in this area people are bound up by confidentiality. Our advice to individual leaders has always been, just to be completely clear, there are things I can't talk about, there are areas I can't go into, rather than obfuscating and sort of trying to slide around that, because that tends to just make the whole message untrustworthy. Because if you've not cleanly said, there are some things over there I can't talk about, I wish I could but I can't, or you don't have to say that bit, but if you say that cleanly, I think most people respect it. They don't necessarily like it, but they respect it, and your integrity is still there. Whereas if you just try and duck around that and say, oh well, we're coming to that, oh well, there are discussions taking place, and blah, 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 and the more you muddy that piece of water, I think the more you lose the personal credibility. So I think that's one important point. But I do think when we were talking about the forum approach or the town halls, and I said it absolutely has to be a two-way street. I think to show that you're listening, and even in the short term, to react to some of those points, there may well be things there that can be covered off almost immediately. And that actually does build people's confidence. So they may be unsure, they may not know exactly what's going to happen, but the feeling that, well, actually, you know what, we told them about that, they did listen about that, and they've said they'll definitely incorporate that. Notice I'm doing we, they again, but that's usually how it is in these circumstances, to some extent at least. So if there's a demonstration that there's listening going on and ideas being incorporated, so there is some sense of building the change, or building the new structure together, then I think that goes a long way towards allaying fear and uncertainty, or at least reducing it to levels that the overall organisation can cope with. Because of course, you know, when you go through these processes, you are putting an organisation under stress. And in the same way that people under stress don't produce great results, organisations under stress generally don't produce great results. So part of the leadership role should be to try to reduce the stress in the organisation. Mike Brearley had a great quote about this. He wrote a book on leadership when he retired from being England cricket captain. And I think he attributes the quote to somebody else. So I'm sorry I can't remember the original source. But he talks about the job of the leader being able to understand the fears of the team or the people, and without dismissing them, I'm not quoting directly here, but to perhaps sort of rearrange them and hand them back in a more orderly way that people are better able to deal with.
Isn't that
I think in the same way that for whatever reason, going right back to the beginning of this conversation, that whether people have done formal leadership training, whether they've been to the business schools, or whether their organisation has great internal training, or whether they've picked a lot of it up from role models and mentors, I still think this whole area of mass communication is very poorly understood, or if it's understood, it's poorly acted on. I think this empathetic behaviour of being able to see how the situation looks from other people's point of view is not well understood or practiced. And I think this third point about allaying fear is a very, very significant part of a leadership role that somewhat gets ignored. It's interesting, actually, because there have been, and there still are, aren't there, great moves. There are whole consultancies founded on bringing lessons from sport and from other forms of leadership. And I was thinking particularly of adventure expeditions back into the business world. Actually, I'm pleased to say we've been extremely successful in taking some lessons from business out into the sporting environment and helping some professional sports teams do better. And without diverting from this conversation, one of the fascinating ones of that was to get a very well-known and professional sport team to actually create a set of competencies, not just for playing their game, although they did include that. So we got them to work out what average looks like and what high performance looks like in their particular world, which is extremely helpful to them. But coming back to the point about leadership, so the one thing I think, because I'm not convinced that these lessons always carry across from sport into business, but one area in which I think they do is if you look at great expedition leaders, they're brilliant at giving their people confidence, allaying fear and giving people confidence, even when the situation changes radically. The obvious example has to be Shackleton. The object of the exercise is to cross Antarctica. The boat gets stuck in the ice. The object of the exercise actually becomes survival, and that becomes a multi-part exercise. But the reason that when Shackleton finally got back to Elephant Island, having got most of the crew there, set off in an open boat across the Southern Ocean with a handful of people, etc., etc. If people don't know the story, I suggest they find out. It's gripping, enthralling, and inspiring. But it then takes him 3 efforts to get a boat back to Elephant Island, where the rest of the crew are. When he gets back there, they are all there. I mean, I don't say by modern standards of health and hygiene they're all totally 100%, but they're all there. And those survivors attributed it to the fact that they knew he'd come back.
Yeah.
Well, actually, it's just a belief, but he'd managed to install in them this amazing confidence, not only in him, but in themselves. That's a somewhat extended story to make a metaphor, but I think that bit of leadership across organisations is very much lacking.
And I was reflecting to myself, what's different about that situation from business, and what can we learn from that? And I'm immediately struck that we know that Ernest Shackleton, or the people knew that he also needed to survive. They were all in it together, and he was there to enable their survival in an organisation. That's not the belief. The belief is, well, the leaders do stuff to suit themselves, and ultimately the organisation always wins, the house always wins. And that takes us back to Simon Sinek's fantastic book, Leaders Eat Last, where the job of the leader is to show that they are responsible for enabling the survival of the tribe.
Yeah, they are. Yeah, that's perfectly put. Actually, I thought what you were going to say was the point I was going to cover off. The difference is Shackleton's men, and they were all men, were volunteers. Now, actually, if I go to work for a company, I've volunteered to work for that business, but that's not how most people see it. Most people fall into should, have to, ought to, must, and it's have to. It's I have to work in order to. Actually, nobody has to work. Any of us can choose to go and live in a cardboard box under Blackfriars Bridge, but people tend to miss that point. So you're dealing with people who don't see themselves as volunteers.
Isn't that interesting? Yes. Yeah.
Actually, just on that point, it's always very dangerous to look at trends and start predicting from them. But we are being told we've got relatively full employment in the UK and in the USA at the moment. And I saw an interesting piece the other day that Amazon wants to increase its workforce by 100,000 people. Where are they going to find them? So it may be that on that basis we are entering a new war for talent. I mean, of course, it may be that automation takes it the other way. After all, if we're going to have effective self-drive vehicles in not very long, then you do wonder what happens to lorry drivers, what happens to taxis, and actually what happens to Uber. So it may go the other way, but in the short term, it does look as though keeping people on board might be a good thing, particularly when there is a lot of intellectual property stored inside those people's heads, which is, again, the more tech your business, the more likely that is to be the case. So people think all the technology is in the software, and there's still quite a lot of it in here generally.
And so just reflecting on some of the things we talked about, when I listen to you talk about it, Alan, you make it all sound very straightforward and very logical. And as we said at the beginning, you are the voice of sanity. And I'm like, oh, well, I'm sure if I had to kind of deal with some enormous restructuring process, using your advice, well, that makes a lot of sense to me. And yet, it's not that straightforward. And many people listening to this, I think, will have the kind of yes, but quote in their thought bubble above their head, which is, oh, well, we can't do that because we have a CEO who's really difficult, or rubs people up the wrong way, or we can't do that because we have a urgent whatever, and they probably need some more help. So what help is available for people who need it?
Yeah, I agree with you. I mean, yeah, it's easy to talk. It's a great proverb from Spain. It's not the same thing to talk of bulls as to be in the bull ring.
This is not.
Yeah, just a funny dramatic example. We're not proving bullfighting here, but so I agree with you. It's easier to talk and to be accused of theorising, and real life is messy. But fundamentally, again, I think people sometimes just charge into this stuff without saying, well, let's do, for instance, a literature search. Academics would, and I'm not one, but would immediately say, well, let's go and study something to do with restructuring in organisations. Okay, who's looked at this? What's been published? What do we think is good research and what isn't? And can we test some of that? To at least give ourselves a model of what might work, what good practice might be. And I think because in business we're also focused on results and on doing what we do and on our own organisation, that people often don't do that. I'm pleased to say I do hear more and more people saying they have done wider information search, at least by going out and trying to find other organisations that have travelled a similar journey. And going back to the point I made earlier, I think very often you learn most from people who are in totally different fields to yourself. It's the truly, and why is that? It's because the truly effective bits are about how you change people's mindsets and attitudes and behaviours. If you can get everybody in favour of what you're trying to do, including the levers. I mean, there's a good example actually. If it is about reducing headcount, find the people who want the voluntary redundancy, and then it's a win-win. So I think that kind of information search has improved, but that would be my first step: is do more of that. Find out what's out there, and yes, talk to the consultants, because any consultancy worth their money is going to come in and have 1, 2, 3 possibly quite lengthy conversations with you about it before they start trying to charge you any money. If they're charging you for an initial chat, I wouldn't be using them. So I think there are lots of resources out there to gather as much information as you can, and at least form a hypothesis about what might be the best way forward in your organisation at this time. And I know we're often under pressure of time, but actually that doesn't have to take that long, particularly not if you are dedicating some resources to it. Instead of trying to get a few people to add this onto their already busy day job, you've got a few specialists to go, or not specialists, but you've got a few people who are going to become specialists to look at it. So I'd say it's almost pre-planning. It's a bit like the Prochaska model of change, actually. We've got to the bit where we, at least at some point of the part of the organisation, we've decided we need to do something. So what we don't want to do is rush into action. We need to do the bit where we prepare for the action. And I think it's that little shift into, I don't mean by preparation, I don't mean all the specific planning. I mean the bit we do before that, before we even sit down to create a plan.
Got it. Thank you so much, Alan. You've been listening to the Change is Vibrant webinar series, where we tackle the real challenges that bring so many organisations unstuck. The next webinar is Reskilling People for Change, where Alan will be explaining how to help your people respond to a changing external market by developing a growth mindset and acquiring some brand new skills that they perhaps never planned on developing. If you'd like to book a conversation with Alan, you can do that via the link in the show notes. The hashtag for this webinar series is #ChangeIsVibrant, and that's with a Y. You can find Vybrant on Twitter @Vybrant.org, and you can find Alan in the same place @Alan J. Sears, and the Vybrant website is www.vybrant.org, and that's with a Y. Many thanks.